This video is a continuation of my series on Bible chronology. For a detailed breakdown of my explanation of Bible chronology, I invite you to listen to my other video entitled Bible Chronology that's about an hour and 40 minutes long. You can also look at the short summary video that I made that's about 6 minutes long or so that explains a brief summary of my Bible chronology. But in this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over a spreadsheet that I put together that basically gives a very detailed year-by-year itemization of the Bible chronology in order to have it properly recorded online. So this will be kind of lengthy. I'm not going to explain the items in this. I'm just going to go over them. If you want the explanations, please refer to my other video. And you may want to make the screen large so you can see a copy of this. But I'm going to go ahead and start going over it detail by detail now. So we'll start with the year of creation, which is 3967 BC. And so this is what I have for the year of creation. And from there we continue down until the year Adam's 130th year. And that is the birth year of Seth. So Adam's 130th year is 3838 BC. And then from there, we keep going until we get to the birth year of Enoch. Okay, and the birth year of Enoch is 3733 BC. From there, we keep going until we get to the birth year of Kenan. And Kenan's birth year is 3643 BC. And from there, we continue on to the birth year of Mahalalel. That gives us the year 3573 BC. From Mahalalel, we go to the birth year of Jared. That gives us 3508 BC. And we continue on until we get to the birth year of Enoch, the seventh from Adam. And Enoch's birth year is the year 3346 BC. And then we continue on to the birth year of Methuselah, the oldest man to ever live. His birth year is 3282 BC. I'm sorry, 3281 BC. Okay. And then Methuselah gives birth to Lamech, and he does so in the year 3094 BC. So continuing on, in the year 3038 BC, we have the death of Adam at age 930. And then we continue on further, and in the year 2981 BC, we have Enoch is translated. Enoch is taken up into heaven. He doesn't die. He walks with God, and he's not, for God took him. This is 365 years after Enoch was born. So this is in the year 2981 BC. Then we continue on further, and we get to the death of Seth. And Seth died in 2926 BC. Then we get to the birth year of Noah. Noah was born in 2912 BC. And then we get to the death year of Enoch. Enoch died in 2828 BC. And then as we continue on further, we get to the death year of Kenan. Kenan died in 2733 BC. Then we continue on and we get to the death year of Mahalalel. Mahalalel died in 2678 BC. Then we move on until we get to the death year of Jared. Jared died in 2546 BC. And we continue on until we get to the year of Noah's 120-year prophecy. This is the prophecy where God says my spirit will not always strive with man, but 120 years will be his days. And so if that's referring to the number of years before the flood, then that prophecy was given in Noah's 480th year, which is the year 2432 BC. Then we continue on, and we have the birth of Japheth in Noah's 500th year, and that's the year 2412 BC, with Ham being born the following year in 2411 BC, and Shem in the next year after that, which is 2410 BC. And then we move on. Now we have the death year of Lamech. Lamech dies at the age of 777, and Lamech dies in the year 2317 BC. And then we have the death of Methuselah, and Methuselah dies the year of the flood, at the start of the flood. And so Methuselah lives to age 969. He's the oldest man listed in the Bible to have ever lived before he saw death. And the year for him, his death, is also the year of the flood, which is the year 2312 BC. So the flood occurred in the year 2312 BC. 2 years after the flood, we have the birth of Arphaxad, the son of Shem, and that's in the year 2310 BC. And then Arphaxad begets Canaan, and this is the Canaan that's listed in the New Testament genealogy of Jesus. And we arrived at this by doing some mathematics based on the Septuagint and converting it to the Masoretic dates, what it should have been. So based on that, we come up with a year for the birth of Canaan as 2275 BC. And then from Canaan, we have the birth of Selah, and this is the year 2245 BC. From the birth of Selah, we have the birth of Eber, and this is the year 2215 BC. Now, I've toyed around with the idea that Eber might be the same person as Job, but I am basically leaning against that because the listing of their children doesn't exactly quite hash out. So I'm kind of leaning against Eber being Job, but Eber is where you get the name Hebrews from, and there's a very good reason for that. Eber lives a long time, and as the other patriarchs from his time period begin to die off, he's kind of the bridge between those two generations because he lives such a long time that he lives into the time of Abraham and so forth. And so he kind of is a bridge between those generations going back to Noah into the generations of Abraham and so forth moving forward. So it's understandable why they would call them Hebrews, because he would have been the forefather that would have most likely passed on the information to those later generations. So Eber, from where you get the name Hebrews, he was born in the year 2215 BC. And then we move on, and we get to the birth year of Peleg. So this is the first possible year for the Tower of Babel, and it's a definite possibility that it could have been in this year. This is the year 2181 BC. It says that in the days of Peleg the earth was divided, which is the Tower of Babel incident, when the languages were confused and everyone was scattered. So Peleg, it might have been the birth year, or it might have been later in Peleg's life. Then we get to the birth of Reu, and this is the year 2151 BC. Now, if we go look at some of the other, just to let you know what's going on here, I have the Tower of Babel possibility for all these years, but at some point in time, the Assyrian chronology starts to pick up, and so that's probably the end of the Tower of Babel and the start of the Syrian Empire, so I'll let you know when that happens. But right now I have the birth of Reu, and I have that in 2151 BC. Then as we continue down a little bit further here, we get to the birth of Serug, and that's in the year 2119 BC. And then the birth of Nahor, and who is the son of Serug, and this is the year 2089 BC. And then Terah, the father of Abraham, this is the year 2060 BC. Excuse me. And then we have the birth of, at age 70, Terah begets Haran, and this is in the year 160, or I'm sorry, in the year 1990 BC. Now, again, please go look at my other video to understand why I have Abraham born a couple years after Haran. I have an explanation for that. But I have Haran as the firstborn in the year 1990 BC. The following year, the birth of his brother Nahor in 1989 BC. And then the year after that, the birth of Abraham in 1988 BC. So then from there, now we have the another possible year for the Tower of Babel is the year 2000, when Abraham is 20 years old, 2,000 years after creation, which is the year 1968 BC. And really the only reason for selecting the year 2,000 years after creation is because it's a nice anchor date. So it's one possible date for the Tower of Babel, because it's exactly 2,000 years after creation. But again, it could happen any time during the life of Peleg. Then we have the death of Noah. And so this is another possible time for the Tower of Babel, because Noah would have been basically the king of humanity at that time, as the eldest and the forefather of all the generations. And so his death could have also caused division, which would have been coinciding with that story of the Tower of Babel. So this occurs in the year 2006 BC. Another possible date for the Tower of Babel is the death of Noah. And then we have the death of Nahor, and this is in the year 1951 BC. And then another possible date, the last possible date for the Tower of Babel incident, which would be the 46th year of Abraham, the 118th year of Terah, and this is the year 1942 BC. This is the year Peleg dies. So that's the last possible year that the Tower of Babel could happen. And Peleg was named division because it says that in his days the earth was divided. So that could mean that in the consummation of his days, at the end of his life, is when the Tower of Babel incident happened. So this is a possible year for that. Then we move on to the death of Reu. And this is in the year 1912 BC. And this is the year that Abraham, who is 75, he still would have been 75 for part of this year, and then he would have turned 76. But before he turned 76, after the death of Reu, while he was still 75, in the year 1912 BC, is when he left his father's house to go to Canaan under the leading of God, who called him out of Ur of the Chaldees and out of Haran. So he's leaving Haran at age 75 in the year 1912 BC. He's going to turn 76 this year, but he hasn't yet. And this is after the death of his father, Reu. This is when he goes to Canaan. Then we have the actually, there's the incident with the battle of the 4 kings against the 5, and Hammurabi, if you've heard of Hammurabi's code, I believe is Amraphel. I believe that Amraphel and Hammurabi are the same individuals, and I believe that he was killed in this battle by Abraham in the year roughly 1903 BC. This is the battle of the 4 kings against the 5 kings who were the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that whole valley. Okay. Then you have the start, after that battle, of the Syrian Empire. Now you also have the birth of Ishmael when Abraham's 87. This is in 1901 BC. And also around this time, shortly before the birth of Ishmael, you have the covenant that God makes with Abraham. This is not the covenant of circumcision, this is the covenant of the parts, where the animals are divided into 2 parts. That's shortly before, so it's around 1902, 1903 BC, somewhere in there. Then we get to the 99th year of Abraham, when God visits him and promises him that the following year he's going to have the birth of Isaac. And this is the year 1889 BC. 1889 BC. This is also the year of the let's see here, of the death of Serug. So Abraham is 99 years old, and his father Serug dies that year. We also have that's also around the time of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it may also be the time, if Eber is Job, that Job's affliction begins. That's a possibility. But again, I'm leaning towards Job and Eber being different people. Okay, so we have the continuation of the Syrian Empire. Now, when Abraham's 100, you have the birth of Isaac in 1888 BC, when Ishmael's about 13 years old. Then you have the death of Arphaxad in the year 1872 BC, followed by the death of Terah in the year 1855 BC. And so we're starting to see some of that prior generation pass away. Then you have the birth of Jacob, and this is an important date. This is the year 1828 BC. And then you have the year in which Canaan dies, Canaan son of Arphaxad. That's the year 1815 BC. Then you have the year of the death of Abraham, which is 1813 BC, followed by the death of Selah, which is in the year 1812 BC. And then you have the death of Shem, and the death of Shem takes place in the year 1810 BC. So a number of patriarchs die around this time. Meanwhile, we have some other interesting things going on, particularly in the life of Jacob. So around the year when Jacob is 77 years old, he goes to get his wives. He leaves to go to Padan Aram. This is in the year 1751 BC. This is the same year that Eber dies, 1751 BC. Now I also have 1751 BC as the start of the year of affliction that was put upon Jacob and his family by Laban by tricking him into marrying two wives. And the names of their children reflect that, but you can refer to my other video for a greater explanation on that. So Jacob spends 20 years working for Laban. He marries Rachel and Leah in the year 1744 BC, and he agrees to work for Laban's cattle in the year, or sheep and goats and so forth, in the year 1737 BC, and he finally leaves in 1731 BC. And this is around the time that Benjamin is born. And I also have an interesting chart here which will show the possible birth years for each of the 12, or birth months for each of the 12 tribe members based on the blood moons of this time, using a calculation of figuring out if the blood moon is a time when either Leah or Rachel was not in a state of pregnancy. And so from that, I was able to derive what the possible birth months were for each of the 12 children. Now there's another scriptural verse that refers to a 450-year period from the start of the time of affliction, which is when Jacob is 77, that's in the year 1751 BC, all the way till the time of the judges. So that 450-year period starts in the year 1751 BC. Next, I have the death of Isaac, and that occurs when Isaac is 180 years old in the year 1708 BC. Then I have the 39th year of Joseph, which is important in his lifetime as far as the famines and his time in Egypt and so forth. There's verses that pertain to that. That's in the year 1698 BC. And then I have also that particular year, 1698 BC, that's the year that Jacob and his family go into Egypt. So that's why that's a critical year. From this year, 1698 BC, the Israelites will spend 300 years in Egypt before they come out during the Exodus. Then in the year 1681 BC, I have the death of Jacob in his 147th year, which is the year 1681 BC. And so we're continuing on here. I have Joseph dying in the year 1627 BC. So that's the death year of Joseph. Then continuing on, we keep going here. We come to Joshua. His birth year is 1418 BC. Then I have the year of the Exodus. In this year, Moses is 80 years old, so you can figure 80 years backwards from this for his birth year. But the Exodus takes place in the year 1398 BC. Excuse me. And Moses was 40 when he fled Egypt. So he's 80 at the time of the Exodus. So from here, we have 40 years in the wilderness. And so in the year 1358 BC is the end of their wandering of 40 years in the wilderness. And then you have 7 years for the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, which brings us to the year 1351 BC. After that 7 years, they divvy up the land. They now own the land, the Israelites do. This is the end of their sojourning. This is the end of the 400 years of affliction. 1351 BC. Then we move on further. Joshua dies at the age of 110. This is in the year 1308 BC. And then the first judge arrives about 8 years later. This starts the time of the judges. This is in 1300 BC. Another thing to keep in mind is that from the conquest of the Canaan, here you see these years with the black on them. These are the sabbatical years. So from the conquest of Canaan, we start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the first sabbatical year is 1344 BC. And then every 7 sets of 7 years, you have a Jubilee year. So our first Jubilee year is around either the year 1309, if we believe it's on the 49th year, or 1308 BC, if we believe it's on the 50th year. So in the 50th year is a Jubilee year. It's 1308 BC is the first Jubilee year. So continuing on with the time of the judges, again, that starts in the year 1300 BC. And as we, that's also the end of that 450-year verse that we mentioned earlier. We're still in the Assyrian Empire time, but this is also the time of the judges. So we continue to go down. The time of the judges lasts quite a while. We start to get into the time frame of Ruth and 1 Samuel. And then we have the start of the reign of Saul. This is in 1004 BC. So that's when the kingdom of Israel begins with the reign of King Saul in the year 1004 BC. Saul's reign lasts 40 years. Sometime shortly before that, Samuel dies, possibly around the age of 91 or so, possibly around 968 BC, but that's a big question mark. Saul, however, his reign ends in 964 BC. Then we have King Ishbosheth, who reigns for 2 years until 962 BC. So 963 BC is his first year, 962 BC is his last year. King David's first year is 961 BC. Also, as a side note, the total number of years for the time of the judges was 296 years. And it ends in 1005 BC with, or 1004 BC, possibly 297 years depending on your reckoning, with the start of the reign of King Saul. So King David, as we mentioned, his reign starts in 961 BC, and David continues to reign until the year 922 BC, his 40th year. Solomon's reign starts the following year in 921 BC, and it says that Solomon's 4th year was exactly 480 years after the Exodus. That's the year 918 BC. That's also the start year for Solomon's temple. That's the year he starts building it. He completes it 7 years later in the year 911 BC, and then he starts the palace in the year 910 BC, and that's completed in his 24th year, which is the year 898 BC. Solomon continues to reign to his 40th year. His 40th year is 882 BC, and then at this time you have a civil war that breaks out and divides the kingdom of Israel into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. The kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And this starts the reign of 2 kings, one for each kingdom. So we have the reign of King Rehoboam in Judah in the year 881 BC, starting, and Jeroboam in Israel in the north in 881 BC. Then we have the accession year of Abijah, around 864 BC, and he reigns roughly to around 862 BC when the reign of Asa starts. And then we have the accession year of Asa around 861 BC. And we have Jeroboam reigning to about 860 BC. And there's a little bit of a play between these because they're keeping different calendars between the 2 kingdoms as when the start of the year is. So there's a little bit of leeway, but the dates all kind of work out when you put them together like this. So just keep in mind there's roughly a year or so play between these dates, but it doesn't add up over time because the 2 are interlinked as far as when one king reigned compared to another king, and so it all works out in the end. So the last year of Jeroboam was around the year 860 BC. Then you have the reign of King Nadab, which is about a year, and it's around 859 BC. Then the reign of King Baasha, around the year 858 BC. Asa, again, is starting around 861 BC. And then you have the reign of King Elah. That's around 835 BC. That's the end of Asa's reign. He reigns for about a year. And then you have Zimri, which only reigns for 1 week. That's around 834 BC. Then you have Omri, and you have a civil war, but there's an interregnum, a period of no king for about 3 years. Some of these interregnums aren't listed in the Bible, but you can see once you put these dates together that there are periods where there aren't kings because of things like civil wars and earthquakes and so forth. So this interregnum lasts till about 830 BC when Omri begins to reign. That's his accession year. And then you have the reign of King Ahab. He starts around 823 BC. Now the other thing to keep in mind too is that there's some overlapping here because there's co-regencies. So, for example, Omri and Ahab would have a co-regency. Basically, that means that you have two kings that are, reigning at the same time. Like, for example, father appoints his son as the heir apparent and lets his reign starts during the father's reign as well. So they're both reigning at the same time for a little period of time as the new king takes over. So co-regencies are not uncommon. So then, as we move on here, we have the reign of Jehoshaphat, and this starts around the year 819 BC. Ahab is reigning independently now around that same year, 819 BC. You have the reign of King Ahaziah around 803 BC. Then the reign of King Joram around 801 BC. The reign of King Joram around 797 BC. And Jehoshaphat's reign ends around 795 BC, so again, you have a co-regency. Then you have King Ahaziah, which is around 790 BC. King Athaliah and King Jehu both start around the same year, which is around 789 BC. And then in the 7th year of Jehu, we have the reign of King Joash, which is 783 BC. Jehu's reign ends, and you have the start of the reign of Jehoahaz in 761 BC. Then you have the reign of King Jehoash, starting around 747 BC. And the following year, the reign of King Amaziah, starting around 746 BC. This is, again, co-regencies. Joash's reign ends around the year 744 BC, and Amaziah no longer has a co-regency. He's reigning all by himself. Likewise, Jehoahaz's reign ends around the year 745 BC, and Jehoash is reigning by himself at that point. Then you have Jeroboam II, and his reign starts around the year 732 BC. Then you have an interregnum. Possibly Jecoliah is ruling with Prince Uzziah. This might be, something that's going on in the history in that time, where maybe one of the possible heir apparents is too young to reign. So that might be what's going on here. But this starts around the year 717 BC and continues to the year 708 BC. And then when Uzziah is 16, he might be old enough to reign at that point, and so that's around the year 706 BC. So that might be the year he actually assumes the throne, with Jecoliah kind of reigning as a regent during that time until he's old enough. Then you have the year of the great earthquake. The earthquake that's so great that it's referenced even in, it'll say that in future times they will flee like the earthquake that occurred in the reign of King Uzziah. That's how renowned this earthquake is. So this earthquake occurs in the year 692 BC, a massive earthquake that really affected more than anything the northern kingdom. So there may have been an interregnum for many years because of this earthquake, or possibly Zechariah might have been, but this is referenced, I believe, in the book of Amos, or there's a minor prophet in the Bible that talks about this earthquake. But there's many years where there's problems in the north because of that earthquake. Meanwhile, King Uzziah continues to reign. You have the reign of a king called Shallum around 668 BC, and then also that same time you have the start of Menachem in 668 BC. And Menachem reigns until the year 658 BC. King Uzziah, he continues to reign till about the year 655 BC. In the year 657 BC, on the northern side, you have Pekahiah, who reigns for a couple years. And then around the same year as the end of the reign of Uzziah, you have the start of the reign of Pekah, which is in 655 BC. In 654 BC, you have the reign of Jotham. And then you have the reign of Ahaz around the year 639 BC. This is possibly the start of the siege of the northern kingdoms, or around this time. So you have, around this time, you've got King Pul, roughly around the year 677 BC, but these dates are hard to pin down. Followed by possibly the start of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser around the year 665 BC. And he may have a co-regency with King Pul, or he might be the same person, but Tiglath-Pileser, however it's pronounced, starts reigning independently around the year 649 BC. Then you have, in the 20th year of Jotham, who may have had a co-regency with Ahaz, Hoshea kills Pekah and takes over. This is in the year 635 BC. This is also the 5th year of the reign of King Ahaz. And then you have another co-regency starting around the year 633 BC, possibly as late as 630 BC. You have Hezekiah becoming king, or a co-regency there. Hoshea is reigning as a vassal under the Assyrians, and he reigns up till about his 6th or 7th year, which is around 629 BC, and then there's a siege possibly. He's throwing off the Assyrian Empire, but that lasts 3 years and it results in the captivity of the Northern Kingdom. So the Northern Kingdom goes into captivity around 627 BC. Now I have the approximate dates of some Babylonian kings, which I won't really get into in this database because I'm not quite sure they're totally accurate. But I'll, for example, I will talk about the Persians, which I believe the reign of Achaemenes starts somewhere around this time, which is around 633 BC. Around the same time as the captivity of the Northern Kingdom. And then you have the reign of Sargon II, starts around 626 BC, and he may have been involved with the captivity, or taking captives. And then Sennacherib, he would have been around the year 616 BC, possibly, laying siege to Hezekiah around that same year. Hezekiah has his illness, which he recovers from in the Bible, where the clock, where the sundial moves back several degrees, about 40 minutes of time, and I think it's about 10 degrees it moves back. This is in the year 613 BC, which is his 21st year. So then, Hezekiah dies in the year 605 BC. His 29th year, 605 BC, Hezekiah dies. Sargon's reign ends around 609 BC. I'm not entirely certain on these particular kings, so there's leeway here. But this is my best rough estimate right now. It doesn't really affect the overall chronology that much, though. Meanwhile, you have the roughly the start of the reign of the Medes around 605 BC. The last year of Achaemenes' reign of the Persians, 610 BC, with Tisbe's reign the following year, 609 BC. Then we have Sennacherib's reign ends around the year 592 BC. Manasseh's reign started around the year 604 BC. Esarhaddon, King Esarhaddon, his reign starts around the year 591 BC. And then ends around the year 580 BC, followed by Ashurbanipal, whose reign starts in 579 BC, roughly. Now, this is an important year. This is the 37th year of the reign of Manasseh in 568 BC. And there is a famous tablet, Babylonian tablet, that has an astronomical observance for this year. And that tablet is dated to the 37th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. However, so first of all, it's like VAT 4956, I think is the name of it. But this tablet is like the key tablet that they use to anchor the entire dating system of the ancient world. There's other things they use as well, but this is like the major centerpiece. So this key tablet is used to basically anchor the Babylonian years and dates and so forth of their kings, and really the chronology of the ancient world from the Persians on back. So the problem is this tablet may have been recorded in the time of the Seleucids around 300s BC, and it may be a copy of an earlier tablet. So it's possible that that name, 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar, might not be the original name if it wasn't copied correctly. But 568, although I don't have it as the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar, I do have it as the 37th year of Manasseh. Instead of Nebuchadnezzar, you'd have Manasseh. So I think that that tablet, and Manasseh would have been a vassal to the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So when it says the 37th year of his reign, it could be referring to the fact that he was paying tribute or under the Babylonian oversight, if you will, or Assyrian oversight. And so that's why it's listed as the 37th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. That's another possibility. But I believe that tablet is actually referring to the 37th year of Manasseh. So that's an important year. So then we're getting into the reigns of these other kings here. Again, I'll kind of skip the Babylonian kings because they're a little more harder to pin down. The start of the reign of Aramnes, I have around 584 BC. Start of reign Arsames, around 559 BC. These are Persians. Phraortes, Median, he's around 551 BC. And let's see here. Then I have the end of the reign of Manasseh around 550 BC. 2 years for the reign of Ammon following him, his reign ending in 548 BC. The start of the year of the reign of Josiah in 547 BC. I have Ashurbanipal's last year as 538 BC. Shimshumilashur in 537 BC. Ashur-Tilili, some of these names are hard to pronounce, in 536 BC. And the start of the reign of Nabopolassar, who is the father of Nebuchadnezzar. His reign starting in 533 BC. I also have possibly the start of the reign of Cyrus I, having his reign starting around the year 538 BC. And I think there's some confusion with historians such as Herodotus and others that confuse Cyrus I with Cyrus the Great and conflate their stories. And so I think that's part of the problem with the dating system. Then I have the start of the reign of Hystaspes around 534 BC. And Cyaxares, I have his reign around 529 BC. And Cyaxares is the one who basically overtakes the Assyrian Empire and kind of brings the Medes into control. So then you have the reign of the Scythians for a short period of time. They start around 520 BC under King Medius, but their reign only lasts till about 493 BC. Then I've got, again, I'll skip the Babylonian kings. So I got Ashurbanipal, his reign ending in 538 BC. I already went through these. Nabopolassar, his reign starting in 533 BC. Now, an important thing happens around this time. So Cyaxares and the Medes strike an alliance with Nabopolassar and the Babylonians. And they're going to form this alliance and overthrow the Assyrian Empire and destroy their capital, Nineveh. So I have this war starting, according to the some of the ancient chronicles from that time, starts around the year, the 10th year of the reign of Nabopolassar. So that's the year 524 BC. This would be, in my opinion, the start of Babylonian autonomy. This is when the Babylonian Empire basically starts, and they start their war against the Assyrians in cooperation with the Medes. Now, if you know much about the history that's given in the textbooks about this time period, with the Persians and the Babylonians and so forth, what I have for my chronology is radically different. I basically believe that the textbooks we have erroneously add about 100 years that aren't there for the reigns of Cyrus and so forth, and that they're missing some major pieces of the puzzle because the historical record is confusing. And so what I have is a lot of the items that you would read in your Persian textbooks, or your textbooks about the Persian history, actually happening around 100 years later, and then many of the Persian era items are happening in conjunction with the Babylonian time frame, not one after the other, because they're in alliance with each other. So, Xerxes and Nabopolassar, the Medes and the Babylonians, conspire to overthrow the Assyrians. And the war starts around, for the Babylonians, around the 10th year of Nabopolassar, 524 BC. And Nineveh finally falls in the year 520 BC. That's the year that I have for the fall of Nineveh, which, again, radically different from your history books, but this is what I believe the Bible is clearly showing. So, the war continues on for a little while, but basically this is the fall of the Assyrian Empire. So, another key anchor date in the reign of Xerxes is an eclipse around the time of his death and the start of the reign of Astyages, and this is called Thal's eclipse. This is a famous eclipse in history. During the time of the Battle of the River Halys, they have a different eclipse in most textbooks farther back. I have the eclipse being around September 1st, 487 BC, possibly November 24th, 493 BC, but I'm more leaning towards the later date of September 1st, 47, because that eclipse better fits the region that it would be viewed at during the time of the Battle of Halys. So, I have the reign of Darius I, starting around 509 BC, and then I have Nabopolassar's last year, and the Battle of Carchemish, an important transition year, battle against the Egyptians and so forth, around 513 BC, and Pharaoh Necho, or I'm not sure how that's pronounced. But back on the Israeli side, we have some events going on. The Passover, the very famous, important Passover that takes place in the 18th year of the reign of Josiah. Okay, so this Passover takes place in the year 530 BC, and this is 40 years before the captivity. And so there's a famous prophecy by Ezekiel that talks about the 40 years that he laid on his side for the house of Judah, and then the 320 years they laid on his side for the house of Israel, the northern kingdom. So if you start with the very first year of the first king of the northern kingdom and count 320 years, it brings you to the year of the captivity. If you start with the Passover date here and go 40 years for the house of Judah, it brings you to the exact same date. And then also, if you count 420 years from the completion of Solomon's temple, that too brings you to the same date. And the 420 years is the number of years that would allot 70 years of captivity, because 2 Chronicles says that the reason why they're given 7 years of captivity in Babylon was because of all the missed Sabbaths that needed to be given to the land during that time. And 420 years of missing Sabbaths begets 70 years of necessary Sabbaths to be recuperated. So that's it. All fits together perfectly. It all fits together like a puzzle. So that definitely would indicate that this chronology is correct. So, you have 517 BC is around the last year of King Jehoahaz, possibly 516, as the accession year for King Jehoiakim. Again, you have the Battle of Carchemish taking place around 513 BC, and it's roughly around this time that Daniel is taken, probably 513 BC, possibly 512 BC. But Daniel's taken to captivity around this time. Then you have the reign of King Jehoiachin, which is for about 3 months. And this happens around 506, 505 BC. More likely 505 BC. Then the accession year of reign of Zedekiah starts that same year. His first year is 504 BC. And an accession year is the last year of the reign of the prior king. The first year of the king is always the following year. The accession year is not his first year. That's the year he comes to power. His first year is always listed as the following full year after his accession year. So, Zedekiah reigns until 494 BC. It is in 494 BC that the temple is burned. That's when the temple is burned. But that's not the start of the 7-year captivity, because this is all taking place in the reign of the King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar's first full year is 512 BC, and the temple is burned in his 19th year, which again is 494 BC. But in his 23rd year, the last of the captives are taken by his commander named Nebuzaradan. That's in the year 490 BC. That's the start of the 70 years of captivity. Okay? And they will last all the way to the year 420 BC, which is the second year of Darius the second, based on my reckoning, and that's when the temple is restarted. So, that's 70 years. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, first year of his reign is around 512 BC. And so in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, the alliance between Nabopolassar and the Medes and Cyaxares was cemented by Cyaxares giving one of his daughters to marry the son of Nabopolassar, namely Nebuchadnezzar. And this is the reason for the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, because Media is a mountainous country. Babylon is not. And so she was homesick for being a Median princess. She was homesick for her mountainous homeland, and so Nebuchadnezzar built this famous mountainous hill, the Hanging Gardens, to basically make her feel like she was back in Media. And so these are the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So that cements the alliance that allows them to throw off the Assyrians. Meanwhile, you have the start of the reign of Xerxes, possibly Ahasuerus, in the year 483 BC. And this would also be possibly the husband of Esther from the book of Esther, which means that the events of Purim take place around the year 471 BC. And then meanwhile, you have in 464 BC, you have the start of the reign of Artaxerxes. Possibly Artaxerxes might be Cyrus, because Josephus says, calls Cyrus, it's in his writings, he says, Cyrus whom the Greeks call Artaxerxes. So it's possible that Artaxerxes might actually be the Cyrus of the Bible. However, Artaxerxes, even though he's in power of the Persians and so forth, he may even be the Cyrus that overthrows Astyages and transfers power from the Medes to the Persians. And he may be the very same Cyrus that overthrows Nabonidus and basically throws off the Median Empire, or the Babylonian Empire. However, Artaxerxes may not have actually took direct control of Babylon until like the last year of his reign. So if he takes direct control of Babylon the last year of his reign, from the perspective of the captives in Babylon, that would be the first year of Cyrus for them, even though it might be the last year of Artaxerxes overall, because that's the first year that they would have been under the rule of Cyrus. So that would have been the end of the captivity, the first year of Cyrus for them, if Artaxerxes is indeed Cyrus, as Josephus indicates that he is. Otherwise, if there's another Cyrus, if there's an actual separate Persian Cyrus, then I would have his reign, the last year of Cyrus the first, his reign being about 479 BC, followed by Cambyses, and then Cambyses the first, his reign ending in 459 BC, followed by the reign of Cyrus. Cyrus's reign ending around the year 425 BC with a co-regency with Cambyses II. This is Cyrus II, or Cyrus the Great. And then Cambyses II's reign ending around 423 BC, if there's a separate Cyrus different from Artaxerxes. But it's possible that this Artaxerxes and the Cyrus are the same people, because one of the interesting things is, if you compare the dates of the ages of Cyrus, Cambyses, Cyrus II, and Cambyses II, the ages of the reigns do very much match up to Darius the First, Xerxes the First, Artaxerxes, and then Xerxes II. It's possible that these two sets of these might be different names for the same people, is what I'm saying, possibly. So, getting back to the Babylonian side, in 470 BC, you have the end of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, followed by 469 BC, the start of the reign of Marduk, who reigns for 2 years. This is the 37th year of the reign of King Jeconiah, and it's very soon after Purim, so it would make sense that Jeconiah would be set free around this time, around the time of the reign of King Marduk. Then we have Neriglissar. His reign starts in 467 BC, followed by Nabonidus, whose reign starts around 463 BC. Nabonidus disappears for about 7 years, and Nabonidus might be carrying the name Nebuchadnezzar as well. See, part of the thing is, if there's someone famous like Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar, their subsequent successors may also use that name in addition to other names, just like Julius Caesar. Okay, Julius Caesar was famous, but that was his actual name. That was his surname. But the name became so renowned and so powerful and carried such persuasion and spread such fear and able to rule with it, that his successors took the name. And they kept calling themselves Caesars because there was power behind the name. So the same thing can apply with names like Cyrus or Nebuchadnezzar. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the same Cyrus. They could actually assume, like in the case of Darius. Darius the First was called Darius Hystaspes because his father's name was Hystaspes. So the name Hystaspes could be carried down to sons, grandsons, and so forth. So same thing with Cyrus. Cyrus could be referring to a number of leaders who all would carry the name Cyrus because of the power of the name. So Nabonidus could also be possibly referred to as Nebuchadnezzar. And Nabonidus disappears for about 7 years in his chronology, which would kind of align to the idea of Nebuchadnezzar going crazy for 7 years in the book of Daniel. Nabonidus loses his rulership to Cyrus. And so the last year of Nabonidus' reign is around the year 447 BC. But he does have a son, Belshazzar, and there is some historical evidence to indicate that Belshazzar served as a governor, at least of Babylon, even if he was under the subjection of the Medes and the Persians. And so Belshazzar's reign, it may have, at least goes to the third year, because we know there's a third year of Belshazzar listed in the book of Daniel. So it's possible to go to 444 BC, but I think that Belshazzar's reign actually continued on all the way down till about 423 or 421 BC in there. And after that time, Darius, who was a son of Xerxes, or Darius the son of Artaxerxes, which would be Darius II, and that's who I believe it is, or possibly another Darius, comes in at this time and takes over Babylon, and there's no more Babylonian, puppet state. There's no more Babylonian kings that are subject. It's now direct rule by the Persians. And that's the end of the Babylonian Empire. Now, the reason why I believe it's 421 BC is because when you get the handwriting on the wall, in the book of Daniel, where it ends basically the reign of Belshazzar, and the Darius the Mede takes over at being about 62 years old. The handwriting on the wall says many, many tekel upsharon, which means 50, 50, 1 and a half. These are coins, but it also means basically like weighed, counted, and divided. That the Babylonian reign was weighed in the balance. They weren't counted worthy, and they were divided between the Medes and the Persians, so forth. I'm badly paraphrasing it, but that's kind of the idea. Well, that totals up in coins to 101 and a half. So if that also is equivocating to years, if we take the year 421 as the year this happens, which is the first year of the reign of Darius, according to Daniel chapter 9, and we allot 101 and a half years back from that point for the Babylonian reign, that brings us to the year, the 10th year of Nabonidus, which is the year that they started their to throw off the Assyrian control in 524 BC. So that's exactly 101 and a half years. So that totally fits with the handwriting on the wall. So all these puzzle pieces just snap together perfectly when you add this all up. So the other thing too is there's something called the Behistun Inscription that talks about how Darius spent a couple years consolidating power. He had to put down rebellions and so forth. He had to. There were other, people were trying to claim to be king in different areas of the empire, and so the first year of Darius II, if that's the same Darius, and it's possible it may be, that his reign would take a couple of years to consolidate, then his first year really wouldn't start till around 421 BC. So what may have happened, and I'll kind of give you the breakdown for what I have as the end of the captivity. So if Artaxerxes is the Cyrus that we're talking about here, and the Cyrus might be Darius, but this is all going to happen around this time frame. So around roughly 424, 423 BC in there, you have the first year of Cyrus, because they come in and they take over the Babylonians. Okay. This may be Artaxerxes. And so from their perspective, it's the first year of Cyrus for them. Okay. So Artaxerxes or someone else, Darius possibly, comes in, they take over. And if you read about the reign of the end of Artaxerxes, what happens is there's some vying between his sons as to who's going to claim the throne. You have a Xerxes II, who reigns for a very short time. You have a Sogdianus, who reigns for a very short time. And according to an historian, Ctesias, it says that he dies while he's drunk at a feast. He's killed, which is very similar to the story that happens in Daniel with Belshazzar, where Belshazzar sees the handwriting on the wall, and he's drunk at this feast, drinking out of the utensils from the temple, and he's slain later that evening. So this might be a tie-in. Okay. So then you have Darius II, who's also vying for power. And so Artaxerxes and Xerxes II and Sogdianus, they could all possibly die at the same time. And there's a scripture in the Bible that talks about God having cut off 3 shepherds in 1 month. And it might be referring to this event. Okay. So if the first year of Cyrus is around 424 BC, or 423, somewhere in there, and you have this vying back and forth between these kings for power, this would explain the events of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah didn't take place over decades and decades. It took place over months, possibly maybe a couple years max, while this power struggle was going on. So they were writing letters back and forth in the reign of the end of Artaxerxes, which is possibly Cyrus, in the reign of Xerxes, which is Ahasuerus possibly, and in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Sogdianus. And his throne name, for all we know, might have been Artaxerxes II. We don't know. I mean, there's a different Artaxerxes II that comes later on, but the point is that this is probably the time frame that all these letters are being written back and forth in Ezra and Nehemiah, and this is taking place over weeks and months, not years. Because in the Persian Empire, they had like a Pony Express system with roads really well built, where communication could travel very fast in the empire. It could get from one end of the empire to the other very quickly, which is part of the reason why they're able to have such a large empire, because they had this excellent communication built in. So these letters that would have been traveling back and forth, they could have been happening around the time these kings are vying for power. And when Darius II finally consolidates power after the end of about 2 years, that's when they finally get the final letter from him that says, yes, go ahead and start the temple. And this would be in the first year of his reign, which would have been around 421 BC, if he takes a couple years to consolidate power. And then the temple starts in 422 BC. So the first year of Darius II in 421 BC is Daniel chapter 9. That's the first year of Darius that's being referred to in Daniel chapter 9. So that's kind of how I see those events kind of shaking out. Now, there is a slight problem with that, and that is the Behistun Inscription, which is this inscription written by Darius, the son of Hystaspes. And this he indicates in the inscription that he is writing this after the time of Nabonidus and after the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And he's putting down rebellions by some Babylonians by the name of Nidin-Tubal and others who are claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar or the son of Nebuchadnezzar and so forth, or the son of Nabonidus. And so these might be the Nebuchadnezzars that are being referred to in books like Baruch and so forth. So the problem with that is, if this Darius is the son of Hystaspes, if it's that Hystaspes, lived quite a bit time earlier. But it could be possible that the Hystaspes that's being talked about is maybe Artaxerxes or something of that nature, because just like Darius was called Darius Hystaspes, that name could possibly be handed down. But what is interesting in the Behistun inscription is that it says that he is the 9th in succession of the kings of Persia. Well, if you go back and look at the kings of Persia and you count them, and he counts it from Achaemenes, okay? So let's count the kings of Persia. Now, Achaemenes actually wasn't a king per se. He would have been a patriarch for their clan, why they're called Achaemenid. But Hystaspes is the one who actually becomes king of a city called Anshan, which is the ancient capital of the ancient Persian Empire. So, but let's start with Achaemenes and say that he's the first king and royalty in their line. So we got Achaemenes is 1, Hystaspes is 2, Ariramnes is 3, Arsamnes is 4, Hystaspes is 5, Darius is 6, Xerxes is 7th, Artaxerxes is 8, okay? And then you have Darius fighting these other kings where he basically takes power. He becomes 9th, okay? So that would make him Darius II if he's 9th in succession, which it says in the Behistun inscription that he is. Now, if we include, we can throw out Achaemenes, because the kingship really doesn't start until Hystaspes when he becomes king of Anshan. Then we can include Xerxes I as a king, and this might be the whole episode that's listed in the Behistun inscription about Bardiya, or the false Smerdis. And you can read the Behistun inscription and the works of Herodotus to kind of understand what's going on there. But basically someone was pretending to be a member of the Persian Empire, a king when he wasn't. And so Darius basically stepped in and killed him and took control back for the empire. But that could have been what was going on. That could have been an allusion to what was going on with Sogdianus and Xerxes II. So if Xerxes II was a legitimate ruler, and we start the rulership at Hystaspes, then that would make Darius II 9th in succession. And that's what the Behistun inscription says, is that he is 9th in the succession of the kings. So that, again, would all fit. But Daniel also says he was 62 years old when he took rulership. And so another possibility is that this Darius might be another Darius that only reigns for a couple of years before the reign of Darius II. And this Darius might be Darius the son of Xerxes instead of Darius the son of Artaxerxes. And so if that's the case, that could possibly put him around that age of 62. Okay? Because the Bible also says that he's Darius the son of Ahasuerus of the seed of the Medes. All right? So here's another question. This line of succession all has to do with the Persians. So why is he called Darius the Mede? Well, again, if you recall earlier, to cement the alliance between the Medes and the Babylonians, a daughter was given to marriage to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so there's a Babylonian claim in the royalty of the Babylonians via Nebuchadnezzar to the Median throne, and one of his daughters, a Babylonian woman, is a mother of Darius II. Okay, so even though Darius II's father may have been Persian, his mother would have been Babylonian via a marriage, ultimately going back to the Median throne from Nebuchadnezzar, and a daughter who is of the Medes. Okay, so Darius II could be a Mede in the sense that he has a claim to the Median throne and to the Persian throne, therefore referring to him as Darius the Mede. Okay, so I believe it's Darius II that's being referred to. So that brings us to the end of the Babylonian captivity. All right, and now we're at in 421 BC. I have as the first year of Darius II. That's Daniel chapter 9, the start of the 70 weeks, the famous prophecy. Daniel chapter 10 goes to the third year of Cyrus. It could be referring to the same time. They might just refer this to the third year of Cyrus because they don't have a set king in place because the Persians are fighting over who's king. Or it could even be going all the way to the time of Darius II's son, Cyrus, who for about 3 years tried to claim the throne. So it could be that third year of Cyrus that's being referred to in Daniel chapter 11 or Daniel chapter 10. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. Either way, that works. But the important thing is that the first year of Darius II in Daniel chapter 9 is 421 BC. And the second year, the restart of the rebuilding of the temple, the official end of the 70 years of captivity, is 420 BC. And this is when the temple begins to be rebuilt under the pleadings of, or under the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah. And part of the reason we know this is because in Haggai and Zechariah, they make some references to laying the foundation of the temple and having them recall, saying things like, do you remember what the old temple looked like? Is it nothing, is this new one nothing compared to that? So whoever was around at the time of Haggai and Zechariah, at the time of the laying of the foundation of the temple, they obviously were able to remember the old temple, which means it couldn't have been a couple hundred years later because they'd have been long dead. So only 70 years could possibly pass around that time. Also, in the case of the book of Esther, okay, Mordecai was one of the individuals taken into captivity in the captivity going into Babylon. Okay, so if the reign of Ahasuerus and the Persians was long after the Babylonian captivity, according to what most people and what Bible scholars would suggest, then Mordecai would have been way too old for the events of Esther to have taken place. But if he was a contemporary during the reign of Xerxes, of Nebuchadnezzar, now it makes much more sense. And if they're an alliance, it makes much more sense too. Because the Babylonians and the Persians and the Medo-Persians were working together. And then the Medo-Persians finally conquered them after the end of the 70 years. So this fits all those different problems. They all come together perfectly in this chronology. So continuing on here. Again, second year Darius, 420 BC. Now we have around 404 BC, we have the start of the reign of Artaxerxes II, and Cyrus the Younger vies for the throne during that time for a couple of years, but he doesn't really win out. We have the start of Ezra. He comes into play around the year, the 7th year of the reign of Artaxerxes II. That's 398 BC. And what's going on in that time frame. In the 20th year of Artaxerxes, Nehemiah shows up on the scene to rebuild the walls. Okay? And then what you have is the walls take about 12 years to build, and they're completed around the year 373 BC. He goes to the king. The gates take 52 days. Not 52 weeks, as I mentioned in the other video by mistake. I misspoke in the other video, but 52 days to build the gates. and then he goes back to the king to report on what he did, and then he returns. And so around the year 372 BC is when he comes back and he cleanses the temple, and you have the whole end of the story of Nehemiah. And then basically from that time on, they've got their city back, they got their temple back, and they have a degree of autonomy, and they continue that autonomy all the way down until the temple is destroyed. They're still puppets of greater empires, but they kind of like have Jerusalem and their temple back, and they're able to kind of like have a nation again. And that continues all the way until the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and then ultimately the final destruction of their nation under the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 AD. But here's an important point that I want to make. The first year, the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel says that there's 490 years until the destruction of the temple in that prophecy. That brings it to 70 AD, and the temple and the city are destroyed in that year, just like the prophecy says. But the prophecy says that 7 sevens will pass before an anointed prince shows up on the scene. That's 49 years, and it says that the walls and the streets will be built even in troubled times, and that'll last about 483 years, and then you have a 7-year covenant. You know, I explained this in the other video, but the point is that if we go from 421 and we count those 49 years, that brings us to the time that Nehemiah comes back and cleanses the temple. There's the completion of the walls of Jerusalem. There's the start of the anointed principality, if you will. It perfectly fits in with that prophecy. Everything fits in perfectly because this happens in the 32nd year of the reign of Artaxerxes. All the pieces fall into place. Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, Daniel, everything falls into place under this chronology perfectly. So this has to be the correct chronology, which means that our history books are very, very wrong. But I will side with the Bible over the history books any day. So Artaxerxes II, his reign lasts about 359 BC. All these other dates are basically roughly equivalent to the history books now. This is all kind of, now the history books start getting things correct. I have roughly the time of Judith, possibly around the reign of Artaxerxes III, but maybe earlier. So around 340s BC, roughly. Not the reign of Judith, but the book of Judith. And then you have, and that's a good example too. There's many times where they purposefully use different names in the Bible. You know, like, and it even alludes to this, like in the book of Revelation, which says, you know, that Jerusalem is spiritually called Sodom or Egypt, where our Lord was crucified. So you can see where they give different names, and they can do that for rulers as well, giving different names. Even though they're talking about one thing, they're kind of talking in code. So that happens in a number of different books, and Judith is one of those books where I believe that they do that. So anyways, you have around the year 334, 333, you have the start of Alexander the Great's march, and I believe this has to do with a very important 2300-year prophecy in the book of Daniel that starts then and leads all the way up to the year 1967 when they get Israel gets the control of the Temple Mount back. But basically, all the rest of the dates here kind of correspond with your traditional historical textbook dates. So I don't really need to go over those in great detail, because you can just look on Wikipedia for the reigns of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and all that kind of stuff. That's all pretty much accurate. I have the birth of Jesus. That is in the year, right. That's correct. It's not what we have right now for our time frame for the birth of Jesus. In my opinion, is correct. So I have his birth around 2 BC, and then around 1 AD is when the wise men show up, and that he has to flee into Egypt. He's a toddler at that point, but his birth is actually 2 years later. There's actually 2 accounts of his birth in the Bible. The account with the wise men is actually when he's about 2 years old. Not quite. And the account of his birth is in the another one of the Gospels. So there's most people confuse those and think they're both about his birth, and I disagree with that. I think they're about 2 years apart. But his birth year I actually have around 2 BC. And so he's 1 years old in 1 BC, and he's 1 turning 2 in 2 BC. So I believe that we actually, our AD and BC is fairly accurate when we use those terms, before Christ and after Christ. And after, not after Christ, but in the year of our Lord, AD. So that brings us to the last key date. Oh, I have the crucifixion, by the way, at 33 AD. The crucifixion, I have that exactly 4,000 years after creation. So I think that's very interesting. Probably almost to the day. Creation would start in the spring, but it's pretty close to that. So 33 AD, April 3rd, is when I have the date for the crucifixion, when Jesus was 33 years old. I have the temple completed in the year 63 AD. This is the confirmation of the covenant in the book of Daniel, the 70 weeks prophecy. Halfway through that, around in 66, the war starts, where they cease to give the offerings on behalf of the Gentiles. This is the ceasing of the daily offerings and sacrifice in the book of Daniel, halfway through that 7-year period, culminating with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the sanctuary in the city, which is the completion of that 490-year prophecy from Daniel chapter 9. And then the fall of Masada I have in the year 74, which is the later date for historians give for the fall of Masada, but that's what I have. And the reason I have that is because from the 8th of Elul, the month of Elul in Hebrew, in 70 AD is when the city was, the last day when the city was basically wiped out by the Romans. That's the great day of destruction. If you count forward from that date, you've got 1,335 days to the fall of Masada in 74 AD on Passover. Okay, that 1,335 is referenced in the book of Daniel. If you count backwards from the 8th of Elul, 1,290 days, you come to the Tu B'Shvat, which is a holiday that has to do with New Year's for trees in Judaism in 67 AD, and this would have been the time for reckoning for tithes. So if they're stopped giving the offerings of the Gentiles, then you're missing those tithes during that time. Jerusalem's not bearing its fruit, okay? And so there's 3 years where you would not collect the fruit from a tree, and then the 4th year that fruit goes to the Lord. There's 3 years where the tree of Jerusalem is not bearing its fruit, and then it's dug around, like there's this parable that Jesus gives about, the tree that does the tree that doesn't bear fruit, and then you dig around it in after 3 years, and if it still doesn't bear fruit, then you cut it down. This to me is an analogy of the siege, where there's 3 years that they don't bear fruit, and then there's a siege placed around Jerusalem, and then the 4th year, because it doesn't give fruit, the Jerusalem is cut down. And so that starts with Tu B'Shvat, 1,290 days before. That's for the accounting of where you would account for the tithes for trees and so forth in Judaism. That's the analogy here. 1,290 days from that point for accounting is the day of reckoning, which is the 8th of Elul. And then 1,335 days after that is the destruction of the temple at Masada, perfectly fitting in with the book of Daniel and those prophecies. So, from there, around 135 AD, you have the destruction of the ancient nation of Israel under the Bar Kokhba revolt, where the blood, they are slaughtered at the location of Batar, and the Talmud records that the blood flowed up to the horses' bridles for basically the distance that's given in the book of Revelation, all the way down to like the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aqaba or somewhere around there. And so that's the end of the ancient nation of Israel. And then rolling forward, these are the years of the diaspora. This is when the prophecy was saying that when it's accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things will be complete. That happened in basically 70 AD to 135 AD. That's when the power of the holy people was scattered throughout all the earth. Okay, not regathered, scattered. So that's referring to that time frame, that prophecy. But then I'll just skip way ahead here. We go all the way to the start of ancient Israel. So they made some declarations in 1947 at the United Nations after World War II about possibly giving Israel their land back. They declared their independence in 1948. And that war, you could say, was kind of like finally solidified, and the peace treaty is signed and so forth in 1949. So one could make the case that 1948 is typically given as the start of the nation of Israel, but the war is still going on. I would say maybe 1949 might be a better year as the start point, but 1948 generally is attributed as the first year. 1967, modern Israel recaptures the Temple Mount. This is exactly 2,300 years after the start of the march of Alexander the Great and his conquest, which again alludes to the 2,300-day prophecy in the book of Daniel. And then we get to the years ahead of us. So right now we're in the year 2018, which I have as 5,985 since creation. Okay. Which means around the year 6,000, which is 2,000 years after the crucifixion, would be the start of the millennium. Because the Bible says that, there's basically the idea is there's 6,000 years of human history and a 1,000-year reign of Christ, of peace. Just like there's 6 days of work and a 7th day of rest, a sabbatical day of rest, the Sabbath. So the Bible talks about this millennial reign of Christ, which means that it has to be starting very, very soon. So the year 6,000, on my reckoning, is around the year 2033, which is also 2,000 years after the crucifixion. Okay? And Jesus talked about how, 2 days, he tear down this temple and he'll raise it again on the 3rd day. A day of the Lord is as 1,000 years, 1,000 years is as a day. He was referring to the temple of his body, but there could be a dual fulfillment for that possibly too, in referring to 2,000 years from the time his body was crucified until the time of his return and the restoration of the temple in Israel. And so that would, again, put it around the year 2033. Now, if there's a 7-year tribulation, and this is debatable, it might be 3.5, it might be 7, it might be even more than that. But if there is, then I would place that start around the year 2026, give or take. Which, interestingly, is the time that Israel would be about 77 years old. And Israel, the person, aka Jacob, he was 77 years old when he went to get his bride. So if Jesus comes back at the beginning of the tribulation for his bride, this would be around the time that Israel is 77 years old, which is very interesting. So it's possible that if there is any kind of a tribulation, it might start around the year 2026. It might not start around the year 2033, 2034. It could happen tomorrow. Jesus can come back at any moment. But the point that I want to make about this is that we're getting very, very, very close to his return. And Bible chronology shows that. So if you've taken the time to watch this whole video, I appreciate it. But hopefully you should kind of see and understand where we are in history and how close we are to Jesus' return. And there's so many of these prophecies in the Bible that were written long before that they occurred, that came to pass, like Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. We have copies of Daniel, or fragments from Daniel chapter 9 in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written long before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So we know that prophecy existed before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and that prophecy perfectly predicted the year that Jerusalem and the temple would be destroyed. So we have evidence of the Bible predicting the future with amazing accuracy. And if that's the case, then we can also rely on the prophecies about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which is going to be happening very soon. So the return of Jesus is very near. It's in our lifetime, which means that if you're not right with God, you need to get right with God. You can talk to your local pastor, your church about that, but basically, the point that I want to make with this video is to understand with a certain level of sobriety how close we are to the return of Christ. And so I appreciate you listening and watching this video. And also want to point out, lastly, that probably puts the end of the 1,000-year reign around the year 3033 and the final judgment, and then after that, eternity. And again, that could be a little bit off. But these are the approximate dates that I have for the Bible. But the main thing I want to show is that the Bible is true, it's accurate, and it's amazingly perfect when you piece it all together. So I appreciate you watching this video, and hope you'll check out my other videos too for greater explanations on this. And God bless, and I hope you check out more videos in the future as well. Okay, thanks very much.